For the other readings in this module, I'm going to highlight some important aspects as I see them, mention a few other points to consider when you're doing these readings. So let's look at chapter 9. In chapter 9, Sims gives us the 5-step process of course design. So what are the 5 steps that you need to do and how to proceed through it when you're designing your course? It's pretty straightforward reading. It's when it comes to learning outcomes that I'd like to say a little bit about that. Now, Sims draws a distinction between learning outcomes and learning objectives, and he prefers learning outcomes. He sees that learning objectives have a shortfall and they are not adequate enough, is Sims' contention. Now, learning objectives do have a lot of problems with them, and there is a lot of criticism about learning objectives themselves. One problem is that very few people can actually write good learning objectives and meaningful learning objectives. So that is a big problem. Misunderstanding and creating poor objectives just gives the whole term of learning objectives no meaning whatsoever. And one common example of a poor learning objective would be something like understand chapter 3. What does that mean? How do I know if you, the learner, have understood chapter 3? So objectives like that are just complete failures, and the other kind of objectives that I have seen they are called objectives, but they're actually just activities that students do. For example, a learning objective that says that students will complete worksheet 2. That is not a learning objective. That is an activity. So it's this kind of misconception that has given learning objectives a bad name. Sims prefers learning outcomes because he says that it is broader and it provides a deeper meaning to assessments. That is what Sims says, but for me personally, right, I'm just flipping back to chapter 9 over here because I wanted to highlight a couple of examples over here and tell you what I'm thinking about. So on page 150 of the textbook, let's look at table 9.6, and that's a course for how to grade using Blackboard. And the learning objectives for this are access assignments and complete the grade book and upload marked assignments. Very straightforward, no problem there whatsoever. I have no issues with those outcomes. But take a look at 9.7, table 9.7. Now over there, just to pick up a couple of them, it says articulate the principles and processes of applied business research. Okay, articulate. Let's just look at that verb. Now, Sims would say this is more comprehensive. I contend that articulate by itself tells me nothing. Now, let's assume that the principles and processes of business research, there might be 10 principles. Now, if my learner can articulate one of them, doesn't that meet that outcome? Isn't he articulating the principles? If he articulates 2 or 3, is that sufficient? Which is why with learning objectives, you make them measurable. So then you would say the 80% that Sims criticizes, and you would say that if my learner can articulate 8 out of 10 of the outcomes, I would say that he is on the way to being successful in this topic. So that's where the numbers come in. And the criticisms for learning objectives are that when you go down to such minute numbers, it's very behavioristic in approach. Fine. Another criticism is that you're not actually looking at deep learning. Just because the person can regurgitate 8 principles doesn't mean they've actually deeply learned it and synthesized the knowledge. Agreed. There is also criticism that you're not taking into account the affect of the person, their feelings and emotions, and especially when you're dealing with humanities, there's this whole connection with the content itself, or even mathematics. My son loves math and he sees it as poetry. So there is this deep connection. I have no clue what that means, but that's what he says. So there is that deep connection, and yes, for him, learning is actually happening. And does saying they can solve 10 problems prove all this? No, it doesn't. And I agree, learning objectives have their shortfall, and they're not perfect. However, when you go into the practical environment, especially in the corporate environment, and you're dealing with return on investment, when you're designing a training program, what does the company CEO want? He wants to know if you're teaching if you're taking 1 hour of my employee's time and teaching them 5 things, at the end of it, what can they show me concretely? Not in an abstract manner, but what can they do to show me that they have learned this? What is my return on investment for that time and money that I have spent in this training? The only way you can satisfy that is through measurable outcomes. When you have things like 80%, 70%, and you put in those kind of very definitive numbers, that is what makes it meaningful for the corporate sector. But it's not limited to the corporate sector, is what I have found. Working in the medical education field now, I find that there people with a positivist approach who are more quantitative in their thinking. They all want numbers. Numbers make sense. You read the newspaper, it's statistics that pops out. It contains credibility because it's supposed to be objective. And that's where your objectives really excel. Again, if you write good objectives, then they will excel there. So there is this tension with objectives, and I think I fall on the side of objectives because I was the head of a department and I had to evaluate 30 educators every 3 months. The only way I could evaluate them and see if they were performing at their best was when there were measurable objectives. Otherwise, things just get very gray and very subjective, which is why I personally fall on the side of objectives. Now, as instructors who have experience, or if you don't, you would align yourself with one or the other, depending on your philosophical bent. And so, when you're reading outcomes and objectives, really think about it. Think about where you fall on the spectrum. What do you believe in? And I am fine with your taking the position of learning outcomes and designing your module with learning outcomes, given you can justify it with very good logical reasoning. If you can do that and you can design meaningful assessments for your learning outcomes, I have no issues with using learning outcomes versus objectives. But again, it has to be done in a well-formed, well-thought-out way. Okay, moving on to Chapter 10. I'm just going to go very quickly over these now. Chapter 10 deals with assets, different kinds of assets. I really like the section where he talks about reusable content, and that is such an amazing facility that we have now with the internet. So I'm sure we'll have discussions on that. Chapter 12 deals with activities and assessments, and he spends a lot of time on assessments, and I think that is really important because assessments are what prove your objectives and they are the end goal. And assessments also need good rubrics, have to be designed well, and they have to be meaningful for the online environment. So he spends quite some time in assessments, and I have added 2 readings which are formative assessments and best practices for e-assessments. Now, in formative assessments, the author talks about what formative assessments are and how they become effective when used in the online environment. And I especially liked the idea of this, where he touches on this whole notion of trust. Because whenever you approach an instructor who has never taught online, one of the first criticisms of online learning is, how do I know the student did the work themselves? They could have had someone else do it for them. So that aspect of trust and building that into the assessments, how do you do that? And so that article touches on those things as well. In best practices, they break it down into what is the best way to do your assessments, and they give you a number of examples of good assessments to be for online learning. And if you put all those strategies along with the rubrics writing strategies that Sims talks about, you have a very comprehensive overview of assessments.